Hi, we're live, I think, right?
Yeah, I think so.
So
Came
I
up,
need to try.
broadcast is live.
Okay. So
I had that Garth moment. I'm not feeling so well.
that's that's kind of what I was going for here. So
We got to get some intro music, something to pump the listener up, something to. And there's so many copyright infringement laws out there where they'll take your shit down immediately, which would be a bummer if putting as much effort as we do into this. But I feel like we need a
exactly.
little immigrant song from Zeppelin or a little Rage Against the Machine, Testify, or something besides silence and then just voices. We gotta
Uh,
have. Maybe I'll learn the guitar this week. I'm an idiot savant, so it shouldn't be too difficult.
yeah, that's all it takes is a week to learn the guitar. Yeah.
That's about it.
Well, if you want some kind of intro, I will give you one. So welcome back to Revolutionary Roulette. I'm Rob Zielinski. You can find me on Instagram at ZobF37, or you could just email the show at revolutionaryroulette@gmail.com. And I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Mr. Joshua Catlow.
Good evening, folks. Thank you for joining us. We greatly appreciate it. You can find me at Joshua Patrick on Facebook and in arguments with random people that I hardly know about life, love, injustice, liberty, stressors, etc. I am at Joshua Catlow on Twitter. And I am on Instagram at Joshua Patrick. So that's my socials where you can find me. Feel free to reach out, ask any questions that you may have. And Robert, the email to the show is
revolutionaryroulette@gmail.com.
I'm going to learn that next week. I promise you.
Especially since I just said it in my intro.
Oh, did you?
Perfect. Yeah.
I thought you had a brain fart. My apologies. I'm too busy checking out my hair and making sure I look well for the go. But
looking good, player. So chapter 2 of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States is titled Drawing the Color Line. So we left off on our timeline with the Iroquois and other Indian tribes in 1635, but we're going to go back a bit to the year 1619, and I'm going to kick things off with a quote from a Black American writer named J. Saunders Redding. Through her bulwarks, black-mouthed cannon yawned. The flag she flew was Dutch, her crew a motley, her port of call an English settlement, Jamestown, in the colony of Virginia. She came, she traded, and shortly afterwards was gone. Probably no ship in modern history has carried a more portentous freight. Her cargo 20 slaves.
It's an interesting way to describe the first instance in which slaves stepped foot on the soil of the eastern shores of Virginia. Mm-hmm. And without getting too far ahead, at that time there was also white people as slaves as well, but they were in no means categorized in the same shape, form, or fashion as their counterparts in the black slaves. So as Saunders illustrated, no other cargo has been quite as mind-blowing as this ship's arrival in 1619.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask just a sort of a general question and, try to answer by the end of the podcast. The end of the episode anyway. So, why do we study history? And I think a lot of it has to do with just making sure humanity doesn't keep making the same mistakes over and over again. Another related issue can be, is it possible for history to help answer today's issues? So with that in mind, Zinn, wants us to think about how does the color line end, or is it possible for white people and black people to live together without hatred? Question, but
it's a deep question, and that's what we're doing this for. We're not here for shits and giggles and just to have conversations back and forth about slave trades or the plight of black people or even some white people at that time. We're here to have the tough discussions and understand what this book was written from the perspective of those who the minorities, the oppressed. Okay.
mhm.
So it gives a view of historical tolerance of their cultures or lack thereof would be more likely. And we're trying to get a better understanding. And to answer the first half of your question, can we learn from history and are we doomed to repeat it? Anybody's paying attention, the answer is a blatant no. I've seen the meme with the "Don't tread on me" snake, and instead of "Don't tread on me," it says "Don't educate me," which I found humorous, but also very depressing in the same time. Um, it's kind of like those who stick to the Confederate flag as not being a national racist symbol, but a part of their heritage. Well, I understand that your ancestors fought for the Confederacy, but I'm also here to tell you that as noble as that may have been for them in that time, it was also blatantly incorrect to fight for the inequalities of human beings. And the main reason you and I are here are to educate ourselves first and foremost, because we both learned this at such a late stage in life, but to educate those who want to be better people as well. That's why we're here. I'm getting a bit verbose, so if you'd like me to keep going, I can answer part two, or if you want to jump in, feel free.
What I would add is we're also trying to be anti-racist, because it's not enough to be not racist. You actually have to be anti-racist and push back against people with bigoted views and thoughts, and have those uncomfortable conversations, because you're probably going to be hearing them from friends and family and people in the community. So Black Americans, all BIPOC Americans, have been fighting this fight for centuries, and
mostly in silence.
Right, mostly, but there have been some, as we'll get to, as we'll see, some, rebellion, some insurrections, but it's up to white people with, their sort of privilege to join the fight and actually, be the flag bearer and be on the front lines of this fight, and push back against other white people or other just anybody with bigoted views. We have to be anti-racist. So, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I do, and we're not here for kumbaya moments either. When we're saying that we have to be anti-racist, that's 100%. Silence is complicit. Being complicit with those views of the oppressor. And I'm not saying that in our conversations we need to be rude or thoughtless, but to bring them up and not speak your mind because you're afraid of hurting a feeling or losing a friend, which I'm getting really fucking good at, might I add. 10, 20 years of friendships have gone down the drain because of changes I am making in my life that I am proud of. and I
It,
wouldn't have it any other way. But
right.
that is going to happen. And when you said need to be on the front line, that's exactly where we need to be. We need to be right next to our brethren, our minorities, people of color, and standing out against oppression that they face and learning about it as well, because it's not just enough to sit back and for yourself to not be racist, but to try and explain the errors of others' ways in a gentle manner as well.
Or in a not so gentle matter if they,
If it
they need to
comes
hear
to
the
it,
tough love.
I put a comment last night in regards to policing and the point of view from being a officer of color, and it felt very wrong for me to speak for a black police officer, but I stated in my opinion that the job of a black police officer is first and foremost to his partner, his allegiance is first and foremost to his partner, to have their six, which is a phrase that you so often see on bumpers or used in the police community, to have your partner's back, and then to the community in and of itself. But if you show me a black police officer that agrees that there is nothing structurally wrong with
Mhm.
the system, then I will not only show you a man that's misinformed, but I'll also show you an Uncle Tom.
So get
And I
back to your
still didn't
point.
get structurally right. That
Structurally.
I'm gonna have to work on that for next
My
week.
my word that's the bane of my existence is colloquially. And I think I just fucking nailed it, but
You
we'll bring
did. I
back
don't
the
know what
day.
it means, but kudos.
It just means conversationally.
Just say that, Dick.
Yeah, I know. So you alluded to this. So those first black people in 1619 Virginia were considered by some dumbass historians as servants, but that's not true. There were some white indentured servants there, yes, but they were not an enslaved peoples like the black people there were.
They got to go home at night and be with their families. As for the black slaves, they were shacked up in coops, and that's a very gentle term for their living quarters.
So slavery rapidly grew into an institution in the New World. And with this abhorrent labor relation between whites and blacks came racism. Um, it's that white supremacist feeling that has stuck by black people for centuries. The feeling that black people are somehow inferior, or as Zinn puts it, that combination of inferior status and derogatory thought we call racism. And that's all it takes, right? Is one derogatory thought. And if you're still having those thoughts, it's time to look in the mirror and ask yourself why you're still having such thoughts. Like, is it because of generational racism that you're still perpetuating for no good reason? It's time for you to figure out what it is exactly and work on that. And we kind of we touched on that a bit just a little while ago.
Um, I have made hundreds of jokes involving the racial climate, um, which I'm not going to repeat right now or for quite some time, because that there are more important issues out there that need to be dealt with. All the great comedians deal with racial jokes, and I felt at a time that that was a road that I wanted to go down by being a comedian. So I too dealt with jokes that were at the cost of black people per se. I've also said racial phrases hundreds and hundreds of times in my life. And the hardest thing for one person to do is hold that mirror up to themselves because it's fucking ugly. You have to be willing and able to be honest with yourself and say, there's something wrong. And you're not born that way, you learn it. Nobody is born inherently racist. You learn it from the people in your family. If you have parents, lucky fucks, you learn that from generations passed down. I've probably learned it from grandparents or in the communities in which I've lived. But I was strong enough to take that first step and look in the mirror and say, this isn't right. Why am I having these feelings? And then seek therapy for it and explain to a therapist, why did I say the N word in that particular instance? And usually when you do, it feels so fucking wrong that you're almost traumatized by it.
Mm-hmm.
So you go back and you piece through your life and where did you go wrong type thoughts. And I think that's one of the reasons why people are so hesitant to take that first step, because deep down they know it's there and they're not quite sure how to deal with it. And I'm here to tell you that just because you've done something in the past doesn't mean that you can't move forward in the future and be opposite and an ally. Lord knows I've made my mistakes when it's along racial lines. But I've learned and I'm changing and I am a work in progress and I want to be an ally. So
yeah,
there it is.
We all are. I mean, we're, the education part of it is a huge part of it. And then, you have to take that step and grapple with it. Not everything in life is easy. So you have to grapple with those thoughts. And it's hard. And, losing friends, arguing with family, it's really hard, but it's got to be done. There's segregationists, there's assimilationists, and then there's anti-racist, and that's what we're striving for. So there's a document in the journals of the House of Burgesses of Virginia from 1969 that I got a little bit of feedback, but hang on. I'm going to try to.
I think that's because I didn't have my headphones plugged in like last week. So I guess I'll put the cans on.
And I'm going to make a note that at 1820, I'm going to try to chop that up.
Did that make a significant difference?
Yes.
Damn it. How come I have to wear the cans and you get to uncomfortable? Anyway, continue, sir.
You have ugly ears. That's why. So there's a document in the journals of the House of Burgesses of Virginia from 1619.
And no, that's not a Game of Thrones reference.
It describes the first 12 years of the colony in Jamestown. The first settlement had about 100 colonizers, and they hardly had any food to eat. We're talking like one ladle worth of barley a day, and that's about it. Then more people came. That means there's even less food for everybody. And the winter of 1609 and 1610 was so brutal, it was actually dubbed the starving time. And Virginians went fucking mad with starvation. Some just tried to like brave the cold and forage the woods for whatever they could find. Still, there wasn't enough food to go around. So they were straight up eating their own shit, other people's shit, dug up the graves of Indians and other settlers and ate the corpses. They were eyeing up people who still had some, I mean, this is terrible to say, but still had some meat on them, and they threatened to kill and eat them. And one fucking guy killed his wife and ate her. They were cuddling, trying to keep each other warm. He killed her, cut her up, fucking seasoned her with salt, and devoured everything except her pretty little head.
Yeah, we've stated numerous times that this isn't going to be a discussion of rose petals and tulips at all times. But this is just some of the things that happen. If you're an American Indian, if you're part of the Algonquin tribe, or if you're sitting back as an indigenous person in that area who is a Chickahomie is the first American Indian tribe that settled or had land in the Virginia area. If you're one of them and you're sitting back watching these people struggle to survive while you're used to dealing with this on a daily basis, you sit back and you laugh like, look at these people and how poorly they're handling it. And I mean, eventually they get overtaken as well. But going back to the person and the digging up of corpses, they would do anything by any means necessary to survive, and at a time that was completely necessary. It's to put that in terms of like an amount of food. A ladle full is just a little less than a cup, and you have to split that amongst 4 people. So, needless to say, your day's work is going to be lacking energy, and you're definitely not getting your proper nutrition. And that's why they lost so many people during that time as well.
So, to build on that, Virginians needed food and some kind of cash crop to export for capital. They needed to grow corn to eat for subsistence, and they needed to grow tobacco to ship back to England.
And had no fucking clue how to do it at first.
Right.
Once again, the Americans are like, look at these assholes.
Growing, corn and all the work that goes into it is not a simple process. They do learn eventually, but it takes a while. And a quick note on tobacco: since it was a pleasurable drug, it was immoral to plant or consume for these religious folks, but it was so profitable that they were willing to just let the morality slide on that one. Just saying.
It's the same way with every we're not going to beat this dead horse again, but it's the same way with religion throughout history, and we will probably say that sentence 100 more times in the next 20 weeks or so, or however many weeks it takes us to get through the book. But it's funny how things change when you're starving, and your moral compass will immediately shift. Tobacco is the devil. Oh shit, tobacco is bringing in copious amounts of cash. Let's roll that shit up, dry that shit up, smoke that shit up. So you got to do what you got to do is essentially the Christian model.
Yeah. And again, not like you alluded to last week. It's not the religion that we're poo-pooing. It's the propping up and hiding behind to kill people, to take advantage of them, that kind of thing. So what the Virginians needed was labor. But most of the free white settlers were either men of leisure. You can break out your pipe now. Or they were skilled craftsmen. So John Smith even had to round these guys up and be like, guys, what the fuck? Get your ass out there and shuck a fucking corn or two. Like, we need you to do something. So they couldn't enslave the Indians because they were outnumbered by a lot. And yeah, the Europeans had better weapons than the Indians and could massacre them, but the massacres would be reciprocated. So that really wasn't an option.
they didn't want strife as well. They could have
Mhm.
used their superior weapons, but the native indigenous people of the land knew how to strike, hide, be more stealth like in the process of being hunted. So
Mhm.
it's quite possible that even with superior weaponry, that they could have been taken down.
Right. I mean,
So
they have the better technology, but this is the Indians' home turf, and they're fucking hunters, and will hunt you down and kill you. So,
exactly, you have the blue collar versus the white collar, and in that type of when it actually comes to fisticuffs, most of the time the blue collar wins, and it's it was probably a smarter decision on their half because they that could have been something that ended it all.
right. So, what was the answer for their need for labor? Black slaves. And by 1619, black slaves wasn't anything new, as a million black people had already been brought from Africa to the Caribbean and South America. I mean, even Portuguese 50 years before Columbus brought 10 African black people back to their capital in Lisbon. So basically, African blacks have been stamped from the beginning as slave labor, and that it's it was the start of slave trade.
Ibram X. Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning, is also a great book that you should add to your must read list. Shameless plug for that gentleman. Slaves of Africa also were used to justify bringing slavery into Europe at a specific period of time as well. So it's like, once again, if we're getting labor, we're going to use whatever excuses we need by any means necessary.
Now, back in 1619, it was easier to crush the will of black people. The Indians were around, and this was their land. The settlers had their own sort of European culture, but the African black people were ripped from their homeland, ripped from their culture, separated from their families, split up, and were forced into slavery. So it's a little bit easier to just kind of break their will and make them stay enslaved. It's not easy, but it made it a little bit easier since they were in a foreign land without family.
Um, this is jumping ahead, but I think it's the perfect segue to do so. So I apologize if I go against your outline or where we were, but I think it's a necessary evil at this point. When slaves were brought over in 1619 to Virginia, they originally were put into 18-inch high cargo areas on said ships, which is about crap, stupid camera, but it's about that much room
Great for
for that.
podcasts too. That's great.
And yeah, exactly. Just envision it. Um,
If you raise your head a little bit, you're going to be hitting your head on the board above you. You don't
yes,
have room
exactly.
to go on your side or flip over. You're laying there for the 90 days it takes to go across the ocean.
And to start out, they were shackled by their neck and their shoulders,
Hang on.
which
We're going to get there.
we're going to get there.
We're going to get there.
All right.
So what else did you have anything else to finish there? Because I know
I was just saying the conditions in which, I mean, it's a pretty, I don't want to say an inferior point, but it's a pretty obvious point that the conditions in which they bring over people that they have no care or respect for aren't going to be the greatest. And it's no surprise that the ships in which they brought them over were filled with excrement and blood and massive amounts of death along the way.
right. And I'm going to have a little bit of an exercise for everybody to go through once
I
we.
don't do exercise.
um, I do want to read a quote from Zinn because I think it will cover a lot of ground here. So, quote, was their culture inferior and so subject to easy destruction? Inferior in military capability? Yes. Vulnerable to whites with guns and ships, but in no other way, except that cultures that are different are often taken as inferior, especially when such a judgment is practical and profitable. Even militarily, while the Westerners could secure forts on the African coast, they were unable to subdue the interior and had to come to terms with its chiefs. The African civilization was a civilization of 100 million people using iron implements and skilled in farming. It had large urban centers and remarkable achievements in weaving, ceramics, sculpture. Most people think, it's just, I don't know, desert and not many people there, and they don't have houses. And but their civilization was similar to what was going on in Europe. They just didn't have certain weapons because they don't have the materials in their environment.
Which we'll get to later in this chapter as well, with
Mhm.
the shipping of steel and things like that, and different things. But when somebody has the talents in which they had, but is from a different nation, they're often viewed upon as a threat by no wrongdoing of their own. You learn skills to get through life and supply you and yours with the best life necessary. So for them to be treated as subhuman for just basically having skills um, to carry them throughout their everyday is one of the ways that the original settlers of Virginia looked upon their counterparts, and it's laughable.
Right. So, just to kind of wrap up that section of it, a report from a Dutchman in 1602 compared the urban areas of Africa to the streets in Amsterdam and the houses of Holland. So, again, if you have a notion that they were a backwards people whom were underdeveloped for their time, you may need to rethink that, or at least research that or re-research that.
That was something that really hit home with me, because you were kind of thinking that often a term that white people use for black people in racism is they're savages. You'll hear that so frequently throughout so many different populations of white culture.
Mm-hmm.
But in all actuality, when we were to think about as everybody back then being essentially savages and not skilled enough, or I'm drawing a blank on the word,
Like
but
civilized.
thank you, civilized to be in everyday life. That is the exact opposite, and I believe I even spoke of that in depth in episode 1. And then you learn about how the cultures were beyond civilized.
Mm-hmm.
And you say to yourself, I'm in chapter 3 and I'm learning all this new shit. And it just blows your mind on you automatically take assumptions and get proved wrong immediately, which is the beauty of studying history if you're actually willing to put in the effort.
That's right. And we're actually only in chapter 2. Our first our intro was just an intro show. Only in chapter 2.
Me scusi.
Oh, good. So to be fair, African states had their own slavery, and Europeans then used that as an excuse to justify their slave trade, as you mentioned earlier.
Well, hey, they're doing it.
Right. So on the other hand, it was more like the serfs of Europe. It was punitive servitude, but the African slaves had rights and could marry and possibly even be adopted by the owner's family. And even a slave trader named John Newton wrote, "No man is permitted to draw blood even from a slave." And that definitely was not happening in the New World settlements. They were whipping and getting as much labor as they could and exhausting the slaves. And, we'll get to that in a minute as to why that is.
Is it okay if we pay off the teas that we spoke about early in the show? Are you ready for that? We could wait a little bit if.
Let's wait a little bit. Let's try to close the loop on this a bit,
Okay.
and then we're already at 36 minutes. So I'm thinking this is most definitely going to be a two-part chapter.
Okay. All right. Continue on, sir.
So, and this isn't praising African slavery in any way. It was just different from the slavery in the Americas, which was more cruel due to capitalism. There was a desire for limitless profit, which put the slaves through hell with exhaustion and just no hope of a future. So the black people were viewed as less than human by the use of racial hatred with the relentless clarity based on color, where white was master, black was slave, as quoted by Zinn. So the racism is really ramping up here.
Once again, just to speak quickly upon religion, organized religion is the devil. When we're speaking of your faith in Christ or a God or Allah or whatever you believe in, we have no issue with that whatsoever, and we're not speaking ill to it. But organized religion has been the cause of so many wars and deaths throughout history that it's a negative I look upon it as a negative thing.
It's like a some negative. Yeah. Like there's so many good things that come out of it, like community, certain moral teachings, things like that. But, all these wars, like you mentioned, always being
they've all been fought in the name of Christianity.
Right.
The reason why I bring up religion again, because for the podcasters at home, I'm using two hands and putting right on par with Christianity is capitalism as being
kind of teetering.
Which one is the two evils? It's like a teeter-totter. Mm-hmm. Just like Christianity, in the name of capitalism and in the name of gaining profit, whether it be by any means necessary, which in most cases it is. We go to today with Bezos exploiting his workers and made $236 billion during the pandemic alone. Or you go to 1619, 1620, and them making money off of tobacco and the farming that they had no fucking clue how to do themselves. So they brought in other people that actually did, because they were able to use force and do that against their will. So capitalism, Christianity, two of the not so good things in the history of the United States.
And now I want you to really brace yourself, because here comes your exercise while you're on this little rant here.
All right.
So I want everybody imagine the capture and sale is happening to them. This is happening to you. Okay. So you get betrayed because you get captured inland by another black person or other black people that get caught up in the slave trade, whether they're, forced to do it for, whatever reason, or they're doing it for selfish reasons. So now you get shackled around the neck and your death march begins. You're forced by gun and whip to march up to 1,000 miles to the coast, and 2 of every 5 people in shackles around you dies.
That's
now,
it.
now you survived the death march to the coast, and you're now thrown in a cage near the beach and wait there for who knows how long until the Europeans get there. Then you're brought out and inspected by a surgeon, like he's fucking Nazi Dr. Mengele. And since you're still in decent shape after the death march, you get branded on the breast like a fucking cow. So buyers can know if you come from a Dutch or English or French company. Then you're put back in the cage with your new brand to fester and get infected. And you just sit there for up to like 15 days until the company's ready for shipment. I'll let you go ahead before I continue on, because that's pretty heavy. How did you feel with all that exercise, that death march?
I felt okay. The marching wasn't great. You just picture yourself being strung up by your own, and that's no different than in the late 1800s and 1950s. I don't want to jump that far, but slaves had to worry about that too when they escaped to New York City, that there were black people around that would get paid handsomely for snitching and saying, "Ooh, look who I found that belongs in North Carolina or South Carolina, excuse me." And so this is something that they've had to do with throughout slavery, and it started in the 1620s. So you're marching to what you feel is probably a certain death because everything around you is putrid and dying and grim and unhealthy. And then you get checked out by a physician that deems you to be in perfect shape, branded on the chest with whatever corresponding brand of your owner, after being examined by probably a more than unqualified doctor.
Yeah.
If you were big and looked muscular, they're going to give you the brand and say he's A-okay because he's going to bring in a shit ton of money. Yeah. And if it's you are the one in shackles, you're probably like, "Hey, doc, instead of checking out the usual physical, could you take a look at my mental health? I have some thoughts on this process that I would like to get off my chest."
Yeah. I think that might get us both off the proverbial hook. So now the real fucking fun begins, because now you board a ship, and I'm going to let the book take over for a minute here, just so, and this was getting back to what you alluded to earlier. So I'm making sure I close this loop as well.
All right.
Then they were packed aboard the slave ships in spaces not much bigger than coffins, chained together in the dark, wet slime of the ship bottom, choking in the stench of their own excrement. Documents of the time describe the conditions. The height, sometimes between decks, was only 18 inches, so that the unfortunate human beings could not turn around or even on their sides, the elevation being less than the breadth of their shoulders. And here they are usually chained to the decks by the neck and legs. In such a place, the sense of misery and suffocation is so great that the Negroes are driven to frenzy. And I was, put myself in those shoes, and I felt like I was suffocating, right? I'm like, just imagine you're basically in a coffin, but you don't even have the opportunity to give it the old Kill Bill, finger punch to break through, because you're shackled down in the coffin. And yeah, it was just it was brutal. It was really hard to write this outline. It took me it took me a minute having to take a few breaks, and I'm just reading and writing about it.
You spoke during pre-production that this was an extremely difficult chapter for you to deal with, and I respect that because it is an extremely difficult book to deal with in general. But
Mhm.
the fact that people are being held against their will, and what was the last word of the sentence you used?
So they're driven to frenzy.
Frenzy. Um, for those of you at home, I'm going to steal Rob's line here. For those of you at home, imagine, imagine. Um, Imagine what you would consider frenzy as being locked up from neck and shoulders and legs. Well, frenzy in this particular case meant that they couldn't breathe. They would have panic attacks. Some of us, a lot of us, are all familiar with that. But then here's where it gets really horrible. Out of said frenzy, they would reach over to people next to them. And in the frenzy, grab a hold, try and kill, to do anything possible to get out of there. They would end up killing people next to them in that little 18 inches of space just because they don't know what the hell's going on. And they're essentially losing their mind in the process of the process, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So when you think of frenzy, you may think of somebody, your cat running around your living room because he's all hopped up on catnip. Um, in this particular instance, people would kill because they were having trouble breathing. So the only thing that made sense to them is, I can't breathe. Maybe I could steal the breath from my neighbor. Let's kill them and try and do the same. So it's not pretty. It is
Yeah.
not pretty at all.
No. So we're talking about 10 to 15 million Africans have been transported as slaves back to the Americas. And that's about like 1/3 of those that were originally seized in Africa because they just kept dying on the death march, and waiting to be shipped, and then dying in transit on the slave ships. So it's roughly estimated that um, Africa lost 50 million human beings to death and slavery in those centuries we call the beginning of modern Western civilization. Um, you know, most people are familiar with um, the Holocaust, and estimates are anywhere from 8 million to 20 million dead Jewish people, and here we're talking about 50 million dead African people. So just something to give you a little perspective on the numbers, because when they get that high, the numbers are just unfathomable. You can't even picture 50 million. Like, how many, uh, you know, baseball stadiums or football stadiums full of people is 50 million? And they're
And
all dead.
to take a different perspective, um, I don't know where the color line, or in this particular instance, the death line is drawn, but the numbers cease to matter after a certain point. I mean, if we're talking two or three people that have perished because of a horrible thing that white people have brought them into, that's horrible, but it's fathomable, and I don't want to say understandable, but you can cope. But once you get past a certain and then you think of the what's the difference between 3 million and 50 million people? It's the most god awful thing that anybody can think of, and they ceased to stop and continued to march forward with the eradication of a human race, or at least trying to, for the betterment of their own people.
Yeah.
European Caucasians, and at the detriment of African Americans being torn from their own land. So I'm not saying that, to clarify, I'm not saying that it doesn't matter that it was 50 million people, but at some point, the act itself is what you focus on instead of the number. Um, and that they wouldn't have cared if it would have been 150 million people. All they cared about is that they were finally getting free labor to gain in abundance the money that they so desperately sought, or gold at that time.
Right. Yeah, it's rough. So we have less than 10 minutes to go. I think that's a pretty good spot to end that part of it. I just want to let folks know that this chapter, there's some hope. Things get slightly better. And we'll go over why that is obviously next week. So I think that's a good spot to close the book. But go ahead and fire away, and I will try to answer within the next 7 minutes here. What was the thing you wanted to ask?
Once again, in post production, you and I were speaking about how we wanted the show to go. In my conversations last evening, I alluded to you that I spoke in the point of view of an African American officer, in which I am definitely not qualified to do so. But I deemed it necessary because to get any type of perspective out there to people that are asking or in need of, or just needing to see a different point of view, I would risk coming off as a know-it-all to try and help them better understand what said Black officer's point of view might be. So I asked you before the show, how do you feel about the fact that we are two Caucasians speaking largely in regards to an African American population? Do you think that that's a good thing? Because I believe it's a good thing, but how do you think we are viewed in doing so? I guess is the biggest question.
So we kind of covered it a little bit. We touched on it, right? Like, again, it's not enough to be not racist. We have to be anti-racist and push it back against the hateful rhetoric that we hear in our communities, amongst our friends, and yes, even in our own families. And Black people, Black Americans, all BIPOC Americans have been fighting the good fight, again, for centuries. And it's time for white people to kind of pick up the mantle and fight, not just along with them, but be on the front lines of the fight.
Essentially, because Black people have been mistreated for so long, most of them won't have a mantle to pick up.
Right. And I know, discussions with friends, and they've said that their Black American friends would tell me that they're doing just fine. Shut the fuck up and mind your business. And
that's where my concern lies.
So that's, fair enough. That's your opinion. If you don't, want me fighting along on your side with you individually, there's something else going on there. And it could be, and I can't wait to kind of get to this part next week. So it's a bit of a teaser there as well. There's a sort of, it's convoluted, right? So I think there's a class issue there where I don't know what their specific environment was like growing up, but they seem to not have the same experiences as just poor people. That includes poor white people and other poor BIPOC Americans.
I think you did a very good job in answering the question. I think I need to come to grips with the fact that there are going to be certain people of color and minority groups that won't like us being Caucasian speaking on behalf of Black people, in which are the ones who suffered.
Well, I wouldn't frame it. I don't mean to,
Cut
step
me
on
off.
that,
Talk.
but
That's what we're here.
I don't think we're like, damn it. How did you say it?
We're not trying to pretend like we know everything or every plight that the Black man or woman has dealt with throughout the course of history. But what we are trying to do is educate our white counterparts, as well as speak to the Black people to show that we're here, we're learning, and we're taking steps in the right direction to become, for the popular word these days, allies.
Yeah, and I feel like BIPOC Americans, like, we're not like speaking for them in any way. So I wouldn't frame it that way. I'm not speaking for BIPOC Americans. I'm just sticking up for them in a way, and addressing the fights that I can have on their behalf.
Speaking our truths on the view of history in which we've learned in recent weeks, months, years.
I'm sorry, say it again.
I said we're essentially speaking our truths the way we've learned the goings on of history within the past couple years, and how that needs to be a more abundant conversation.
Yeah.
We don't, like I said, we don't pretend to know or talk for people of color or BIPOC folks as well. But what we do intend to do is try and educate as many of those who are willing to learn. And we're not trying to say we're know-it-alls. We're going to, even though we've read this book cover to cover, both of us, and we've done it pretty close to a couple times now, we're going to make mistakes in regards to that. And if you're listening and you catch something, please let us know. revolutionaryroulette@gmail.com, or hit us up on one of our Twitter things, or socials. But we're just doing the best that we can as people to be a part of the change and not a part of the problem.
Well said. And there are a couple comments, but I will screenshot these and save them for next week. Maybe we could start off with that from JD Shore. We're running out of time here. So I hope those are your closing thoughts, because we have a minute left. Again, you're Joshua Catlow. The socials again, real quick.
Social media: Facebook, I am at Joshua Patrick. Instagram at Joshua Patrick. Twitter at Joshua Catlow. And that's about it.
Okay. I'm mostly on Instagram, ZobF37, ZOBF37, or on Twitter at Rob Zielinski, ZIELINSKI. Best way to get a hold of us probably will be the show email, revolutionaryroulette@gmail.com.
You got a quick teaser for next week?
Yeah, well, it's just going to be part 2. We're going to learn a little bit more about how we can try to create a sort of class consciousness, no matter what the race is. So,
Any kind of consciousness is good consciousness, as Bill Murray would say. I'll have total consciousness on my deathbed, so that's I got that going for me, which would be nice.
Thanks, folks.
Have a good one.